Hi everyone, welcome back to book club. I am very excited for today's book club because I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy, my favorite thing in the world, of Rachel Khong's novel, Real Americans. This is Rachel's second novel. Her debut novel, Goodbye Vitamin, was published in 2017, and it was named Best Book of the Year by NPR, Vogue, and Esquire. Real Americans is split into multiple stories, one following a 22-year-old Lily Chen into an unlikely love story, and one following a 15-year-old Nick Chen who doesn't know his father and doesn't fully trust his unconventional mother, Lily. It's a story about family and forgiveness, but more than that, it's also a story about race and visibility. The publisher prefaces the novel with a question: are we destined or made? And if so, who gets to do the making? So without further ado, and maybe someone who is best equipped to answer this question, let's bring on Rachel. Thank you so much for doing this. I was so
Sure.
excited and so looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this is such an honor.
Should we get into it?
Yeah.
So this is your second novel. Your first was so well received. What was the process of writing this one versus your debut novel, Goodbye Vitamin?
That first book was really about wondering if I could even write a book. There's that question of, is this even possible for me? The first book was very much in these fragments. It was sort of PC, more diary entry style. That was sort of what I could do at the time. I was working on that book while I was in graduate school, but also then like working full-time jobs, working at restaurants, and sort of writing in whatever snatches of time that I could.
Mhm.
Um, and so for this book, my life just had, I think, more stability in it. This book was still more than I could really handle when I began it.
Mhm.
I always like to start a project and um, feel a little daunted by it, feel like I can't finish it, or I don't know quite how to get there. And the goal is always sort of to become the person who can finish it.
I know that the New York Times called your writing, among other things, quietly brilliant. In reference to the way that you build relationships in your work, which I think is such a testament to the way that you write. In Real Americans, I think this also applies. Like you're able to build such nuanced relationships without being overly flowery about how you distinguish one character's wants from another. Do you think your language and the way that you use certain dialogue is what these character interactions are truly built on?
I know that character really matters to me when I read, and it feels often really elusive when a writer is doing it well. You're kind of wondering how exactly
Oh.
are they making this magic? And so I think that is what I'm going for the sort of feeling of seamlessness, where you're
Mhm.
maybe turning the pages and you don't even quite know what the moment is, where you're totally in it with this character and you believe that they're a human being.
And what's your interpretation of this idea of quiet brilliance?
Um, I would love if everybody thought that it was quietly
Wait in.
brilliant. But I also know that plenty of people don't think it's quietly brilliant. So yeah, it's related to what I'm talking about, right? It's there's something that is a little bit understated about it, where I think that is my goal, to sort of catch you by surprise and to not show the seams of where I'm doing this, character building.
Yeah, I think that rings really true also in the opening of chapter 18. There's this really stunning and magical moment that's also woven in with the normalcy kind of all at once. And there's these cerebral moments that are so grounded in reality. And I think that's what makes your writing so special. How do you wedge these huge thoughts or these more abstract thoughts that the characters are having between moments rooted in realism so seamlessly?
Maybe it's a little bit related to music somehow. I'm thinking about it in terms of rhythms. You want to be taking the reader along, but it can't all be at the same register. It can't all be the same sort of tempo. And you're sort of always modulating and adjusting based on where the story is and where the reader needs to go. And what I've always been interested in is just the complexity of emotions in just human experience, right? Like the fact that I never have just like a pure emotion, like, straight up, right? Maybe I can think of a couple moments of really sad times, but for the most part, it's like I feel sad and then I'm I'm laughing. So I really love it when authors, yeah, maybe are just funny and then like really hit you with a sad note, or maybe something sad
Mhm.
is happening and then the tenor completely changes. So I think I love seeing the mix of human emotions all up against each other. You know, sadness sharpens humor and the other way around.
That's
Yeah.
what I love so much about literature is we get let in on these sort of internal monologues that normally are just happening privately. I mean, you have this moment where May kind of goes into this whole really abstract concept of, aren't we lucky our DNA encodes for innumerable possible people? And then it's followed by Nick poured me tea. And it's like such a simple moment that's happening on the surface. And then you have all this that's kind of pouring out of her.
I think that's how it goes, right? Like
Mhm.
sometimes you have these realizations in the most mundane moments, or say you're
Mhm.
in a mundane moment and then you're just overwhelmed by the fact that you really love this person, or you're so happy to be here or something. You know,
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
that's just the nature of what it's like to be alive. And it's so strange and it's so special to get to capture it in writing, you know?
Yeah. There's a quote in the book, time passes indifferent to me. So much of my life I've let slip by because I have not attended to it. Did you find it difficult to cover such an expansive timeline in a novel?
Definitely. It's a lot of time that gets covered. I think it starts in 1999 and then it ends in 2030. And that's just this huge expanse. Like, I didn't necessarily set out to write a novel that was so epic. It was more that the characters kind of kept leading me in that direction.
When inspiration initially struck, what character did you begin with? Was there one character or did they all come to you at once?
Well, it started with Lily and with Lily's section, part one. And I thought I was writing a short story just in the voice of this young woman living in New York. And then it sort of became clear that this was not a story, it was actually a novel.
Mm.
Um, and I don't exactly remember how, but it did happen where, you know, Nick came next and then May came next. Each of the characters came in the order that they appear in the book.
I had recently the pleasure of talking to Kaveh Akbar, who spoke of how his novel Martyr isn't autobiographical in a traditional sense. However, there are elements of himself and his experiences scattered throughout the story across multiple different characters. Do you find like connection like this exists between yourself and the stories you tell?
Definitely. Not that the things that happened are true. I mean, it would be totally nuts if the things that happened in this
I
book were
I hope
true.
that they aren't true for
I
yourself.
know. But emotionally, you know, so
Mm,
much overlaps with my experience. I write in part to work through some of those experiences, but also just like have more compassion for the parts of me that I don't necessarily in life have compassion
mm,
for, you know?
yeah.
And so with May, for example, she has this overwhelming sense of ambition and the sort of
Mm,
inability to express love to the people she really loves. I was sort of articulating this way in which I grew up, which is like to be ambitious, right? Um, to believe that it was so important to be a productive person, that productivity made me a valuable person.
yeah.
And I think that's something that May shares, and she feels like she has to prove herself as a human being. That's something that I was exploring in her section, but really am just like thinking about in my own life, you know?
Absolutely. And I always find it so fascinating how willing and quick we are to forgive other people for things that
Yeah.
often we can't extend that same olive branch of forgiveness to ourselves should we be going through the same emotions. And
Yeah.
I always find that literature is a perfect way to explore that because we have so much empathy for the characters we're reading about. And then we're kind of forced to hold the mirror on ourselves and think, would I do that? Would I give that same forgiveness to myself? I also think it's really important to talk about race and visibility in this novel. Lily is Chinese American, and there are such subtle nuances to how you show her supreme awareness of feeling other in a room full of white men. There is a line toward the beginning of the novel where Lily says, there was one handful of Asian women in the room, and silently I wished for more of us, or none of us at all. It really doesn't go further than that. It's just a statement and the story progresses. But I found that I was still thinking about this line as the story went on. Can we sort of expand on this line a little bit? Do you think that Lily's exhaustion and apathy and annoyance derives from having to prove or explain her presence to herself or to others, or both?
I think it's both. I think
Mm,
I said this in the past, it's in 1999 that she's having these thoughts, but they're not thoughts that are unfamiliar to me. I think that I'm really interested in writing about the Asian American experience, the way that I've experienced it
mm,
for Lily, and at times in my own life, it's not that I'm sort of going about my life constantly thinking about the fact that I'm Asian. It's more that other people remind me of it in moments
yeah,
that I think are pretty unexpected. Now we have this word, obviously, microaggression, and
mm,
that's sort of where that has often just manifested. And so I think I was really interested with Lily's experience, for her as a character to just feel so, she feels so American,
yeah,
fundamentally. Like she has never known anything else.
yeah,
In America, she feels so American, and yet there are these moments where she is reminded of her otherness.
yeah,
When there are other people who don't look like her in a room, or when she's at in 1999, and even now, there's not a ton of representation, right? It's slowly getting better, but even in the media, in film and TV, she isn't seeing models of other
yeah.
Americans in her life. And so, um, yeah, I was interested in just rendering that experience on the page because it's really specific, but it's really real, I think, to a lot of people.
Absolutely. And this concept of being a real American is referenced so many times in dialogue when people are questioning where a character belongs. For example, when Zhu Ping asks Lily, "Your husband, is he American?" She internally makes note he meant white American. It was what people meant here. And later, when Lily reveals she can't read Chinese, he says, "You're very American, a real American." What is your interpretation of the American identity? Like, what do you think it is really? And why do you think people, even still, have such a hard time grasping the concept of American looking like so many different things?
I mean, I think that's exactly right, that American means so many different things and looks
Yeah,
so many different ways, but it's so hard for people to grasp that. I think there's still this idea of American meaning a white person. The fact that there is still this very narrow idea of it, that's something that I find so interesting, that we've held on to that for so long, and we
yeah,
still do. I think things are changing. They're always changing a little bit, but we're
yeah,
still so far away from
yeah.
um, real acceptance and understanding. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it creates such different experiences for people. Like I know that if, someone said, "Where are you from?" and I said, "Oh, I'm American," they wouldn't have more questions for me.
Yeah.
And I know that is not the truth for everyone. They would say, "But where are you really from?" or where is your family from? Or
Right.
where. And I think that it sort of creates this separation that is not based in the truth of what America is built on. And, as Lily says very well, it creates this feeling of otherness.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always writing toward sort of a hope that in the future things will be different, and that's a reason that I'm writing about this, right?
Yeah.
It's a way to say here's how it has been, and
Mm.
are we going to keep doing things this way?
Yeah. I'm curious because you were writing Lily's story in the 90s. Did you feel like you had to kind of go back a bit and revert back to old ways, or did you feel like there were still a lot of similarities on how that experience would be like today in 2024?
I think I did revert a little, I did sort of think about like the older
Yeah.
Asian women in my life, and
Yeah.
think about what their experiences might have been like. And I do think things are very different now. There's much more community, I think, especially because the internet has made that possible, and social media has made that possible. And so things are really different there. Just, these movements are able to find one another. But yeah, there was a lot of research for each of the characters because I haven't lived their lives exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever feel your personal Americanness, if you will, was
Mhm.
questioned or challenged growing up as an Asian woman in California?
I will say when I was growing up, I lived in these sort of desert towns in Southern California. And so it was these places like Indio and San Dimas and
Mm.
Rancho Cucamonga. And I was often the only Asian kid in school aside from my younger brother.
Mm.
And because we were also new immigrants, my family came from Malaysia when I was 2 years old. Um, there was this feeling that I didn't belong. I couldn't fit in even if I wanted to. I looked visibly different and my culture was different. And these like very mean boys would make fun of me in class because I didn't quite know how to say English in the way that an American would speak English. There was a sense that I needed to prove myself, right? As an American, I needed to speak a certain way and to like certain things. I was eventually naturalized as a citizen, but for many years I had this laminated card that said resident alien. And so
Yeah.
that was just like, you know, I had, this like sad picture of me on this resident alien card, and it was so othering and it was just a lot for a little kid. And deep down is still there, like that feeling of like needing to prove the Americanness. And I think I share this feeling with Lily that, that I am totally American. Like that's like what I know to the exclusion of so many other things. Like now in retrospect, I wish I had spent more time learning Chinese or
Yeah.
I had really spent more time with um certain aspects of my culture that I sort of denounced in order to just fully assimilate.
Yeah.
Um, but again, with her experience too, it's when she goes to China, goes, to an Asian country,
Mm.
she's recognized as an American because that is what she is, right? It's just in her home country, she's still viewed as other because of the way that she looks.
Yeah. And how do you think that those experiences shaped who you are today and the way that you approach your writing?
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, definitely something I need to work out in therapy, um, and it's been funny in this period, sort of before the book comes out. It's just, I mean, I don't know if you can imagine just like a anxiety-ridden time, and you're just sort of waiting.
I
Like
cannot imagine. It's like you form this thing out of that's so much made up of your DNA and who you are, and then all of a sudden you have to give it to the world and like let them form their own opinions about it. To me, it's the scariest thing. That's why I
yeah,
don't. I respect
yeah.
everyone who's brave enough to do that.
I mean, it's so personal, right? And it took so many years, and it's not just um it's something that I've been thinking about for so many years, working on for so many years, and really like involves, I think, some really deep parts of me and things that I really care about. And so to go into this moment that is like a little bit more exposing, that it's that where you're left open to judgment and people are often making really quick judgments of this thing that you've worked so hard on. Of course, it's part of the job, but it's interesting that I've done this to myself because it feels so similar to that feeling of being a kid and like and and wondering if my English was okay, if I was doing things correctly, or if
Wow.
the people who really mattered would accept me. So
Yeah.
it's like some kind of deep stuff,
Yeah.
and um, and it does feel really exposing, but I think part of the reason I'm doing it is because it's this belief in my own work sort of separate from other people's belief in it. Or
I also think that sometimes the more personal the work is, the harder it is to share it, the harder it is to open it up for criticism or other opinions on it. But I also think those things can be so deeply rooted in us that if we don't kind of like, spread the
yeah,
seeds with the
yeah,
to the world and give them to other people, they like form lives of their own inside of us that aren't always the most productive.
yeah, exactly. The goal is that these things that are so personal to me that I've thought of for so long, and these really deep like wounds and emotions, that hopefully they will matter to somebody else. Like they'll find the person that it really needs to find.
I was talking about this recently with someone, like the more specific a piece of art is, the more it touches someone, I find.
Mhm.
Like, even
Yeah.
if the experience is completely different than anyone I've had, our human emotions at their core are still true across
Yeah.
everyone. And so I think being able to relate to stories, like I have had none of the same experiences as Lily or May or Nick, and yet there were moments of extreme emotion and depth that all of them had that I truly that rings so true for me. And I think that that's why it's so important to write these stories that are very specific and very personal, because like that's how we connect.
Yeah, absolutely.
You explore the concept of language and at times feeling lost in translation. Do you believe that language is something that connects us or separates us?
Oh my God, this question.
I know, or both.
I mean, that's at the heart of so many, that's at the heart of writing, honestly, right? Like I think both, because language is the best tool that we have for understanding each other and for bridging these huge divides in experience, as you've talked about, right? Like the fact that I can connect to a fictional character
Mhm.
who is so different from me personally. I think that really means something. But at the same time, this book is so much about miscommunications and about the ways in which language fails us. Even the word love, I think, can um, mean different things to different people, or maybe not feel true to one character when it feels true to another. Language it's really the best that we have, and yet it's so insufficient in so many ways.
I was talking about this too with Kaveh, like the sort of insufficientness of language when it is our only way of communicating sometimes can feel both infuriating and also magical that there are spaces that will inevitably exist between language that we cannot find words for.
Right. And I think books, honestly, novels, poems, books and writing that has taken real effort and thought, like that to me is one of the best ways of actually communicating with one another, with just like getting at these really deep and true experiences that we each have. And so I like fully believe in the power of books, but I also believe in this other thing, which is like where books fail, right? Like I think
Mhm.
there's something that's just as important, even probably more important, about just like being in the presence of another person
Yeah.
and that experience, that like physical experience that is not this yeah, that's not so based in language or the mind, but is just about like presence and like, yeah, I don't know,
Yeah.
for lack of a
No,
better word. That's a bad word, but
absolutely.
yeah.
No, there's a wonderful quote that you have in the book that says, Chinese is a language that exists in the present tense. In this way, it is unlike English, a language in which it is easy to say, I had a past, I will have a future. When I adopted English as my own, I lived so much in the hope of what was to come. See, so I think I've only ever known English, and I think Americans kind of innately live in the past and the future, and it's so much of like what is coming, and the fact that there are languages out there that don't even have a word for that is
Yeah.
really I thought it was exploring that concept was really interesting.
And it shapes your perspective, right? Like I grew up with English and feel the same, that same tendency to look to the past, obsess over the past, or obsess over the future. I think as a kid, I was always looking to the future, always thinking, what's the next thing going to be? How is my life going to be different in the future? Um, and that is such an American thing, I think, to believe that the
Yeah.
future is going to be so great or could be so great. And of course, I love that optimism, but I also think there's something lost in just not existing in the present, right?
Yeah. Yeah. In your everyday life, do you find your own awareness that time is passing to be overwhelming? And how did you approach capturing the anxiety around this?
I think this is such, again, an American belief that time matters so much,
No,
right?
the anxiety that the clock just keeps ticking and
Yeah, that the clock is ticking, that we're in a race against time, that we have to use time like it's something
Mm,
that is for us to use.
yes.
And there's so much anxiety around it. Obviously, um, it's sort of built into the capitalist system that like the worker has to clock in and out, and you only have so much time that's your own. And so I think that's something that I was 100% raised with, right? This belief that I had to like make the most of my time, that time was valuable, time is money. Um, and and I think for many years while I was writing these books, I had these full-time jobs or more than full-time jobs and had to squeeze my writing into like the smallest portion of my day, to sort of wake up an hour early and write as much as I could, or write on weekends or write on vacations. And so that sort of always exacerbated this feeling of, time is running out, I need more time.
Yeah.
But I think lately I'm trying to divest from that belief a little bit, right? Because I
Yeah.
think it's sort of it's a setup for failure, honestly. You
Yeah.
can never really like master time. It's coming
No.
for you.
Yes,
Yeah.
we will always lose every time. I read this fascinating article a couple years ago called The Tyranny of Time, and it was just about that time was basically something that was created alongside capitalism because
Mhm.
you couldn't just be like, meet me when the sun is at this height. There had to be structure to our days, but that ultimately time is not something that can be measured in the way that we measure it. And it is our only non-replenishable resource. And the fact that it feels like, especially in America, we have agency over it and we have control over it, is really, I think, just a false belief system to build your
Yeah.
life.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I think, we're so oriented toward this kind of lifestyle in which, maybe you meet a friend for an hour for coffee, or you set your schedule and you have these appointments. But I
Mm.
kind of just miss the hanging out that we used to do as kids, where there was no it wasn't like an hour for coffee, you just like hung
Yeah.
out together all
You were
day.
penciling it in, and I have an appointment
Yeah.
right after this. And yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's how these really deep relationships get made, right? Like when you're spending hours and hours of time with people and you're not keeping track of it. You're just like, hey, let's go, whatever, do our laundry together or
yeah,
something. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, and I think novels that paint a portrait of intergenerational family spanning across so much time seem to require what I imagine to be very intense world building. I was just wondering if you seek inspiration from any specific novels or authors. Who do you feel like has influenced your writing the most, whether it be subconscious or intentional?
Oh, yeah, there's so many people, obviously, so many answers to that question. This is very much a book about science. With the introduction of magic, I was able to introduce this idea that like we can't understand everything. There are things that are still fundamentally mysterious and that we don't understand. I was thinking about books that sort of seamlessly have like science and magic. One of the books that I read sort of halfway through writing this novel that was really influential was A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. Just this really hard to categorize book. It's
Yeah.
really got so many elements to it. Ishiguro is another author that I love. These things that aren't really possible yet, or aren't reality. He makes them feel so lived in,
Yeah.
um, and the characters feel so, yeah, just so real.
Mm.
Um, so he was a big influence too. Yeah, I think when the emotions feel true, then you're able to go along with a
Yeah.
lot of fiction.
Yeah. Um, I'm gonna ask you an impossible question that you don't have to answer, but it is asked at the beginning of your novel. Are we destined or made? And if so, who gets to do the making?
I think it is indeed an impossible question. It's the question that is sort of at the heart of this book, I
Mm.
think. And and I think the answer, honestly, having grappled with it for 400 pages,
Yeah.
is that it's both. There are some things that we don't get to choose about who we are. There's a lot of things actually, and there are still a lot of things that we do. The reason I think that I wrote this book, well, a reason that I wrote this book is that um, I think as an immigrant, I'm always sort of imagining other lives that could have been. If I had stayed in Malaysia, what would my life look like then? Would I be a writer? I think everyone has a version of this, right? Like you kind of wonder if I had made this decision and not this other one, how would my life have turned out?
Yeah.
And there's so many of these like moments throughout your life, and you close the door and you kind of can't go back. After a certain point in time, you can't go back and you can't change things or make them go a different way. Having that question in mind also makes me wonder often, like, why does my life get to be luckier than other people's, right?
Mhm.
Like, why do I have all these privileges that I do when other people, just because of the fact of where they're born, don't have the same privileges or don't have the same opportunity to become writers if they want to be, or become whatever they want to be. It's just like deeply unfair. And
Yeah.
so that is like the question of this book, like how much do we get to choose? But also like why?
Yeah, like
And
why do we have choice when others don't?
yeah. Yeah. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. And I think as individuals, there's obviously limits to what we can do, right? And like how we can change the world. Like so many of these characters, I mean, all of the characters in this book are shaped by their time, their circumstance, these political structures that are shaping their lives, like as are we. But I think they do still have agency in their lives, and they have these ways in which they can sort of make these small protests, or just, I think, affect change within the relationships in their life. And so I think that's what we have too, right? We have we're not, yeah, absolved of everything. We do
Yeah.
still have to do a lot, but yeah, and it's kind of it's up to us to figure out what that is and to do it.
Yeah. I think that Past Lives sort of captured it so beautifully because it was not
Mhm.
wrapped up in a pretty bow. It was like both of these realities can exist at once. You can love two people, you can long for a life that you never got to experience, and also love the life that you have today. And I think it just
Yeah,
shows such an honest portrayal of that feeling of like, well, what would have happened if I would have gone this way instead of this way?
yeah, yeah. There's
Um,
this Susan Sontag quote that I love, where she says, "What I wanted was every kind of life, and the writer's life was the most inclusive."
hmm.
Um, and I
Uh,
think the reader's life also, like, yeah.
Yeah, although we don't have to, we get to grapple with the 400 pages once they're already written and not, the exploration through that. So I do think that maybe we have it a bit easier. Now I have two easy, fun questions because I just made you answer that question. Um, what book, if there is one, do you find yourself gifting the most often?
I I love Deborah Levy. A book that I love of hers that I give often is The Cost of Living, which is, you have to read it. I mean, you would
Okay,
love it. It's
okay,
it's
amazing.
so good. It's about it's she calls it a living autobiography. And so it's like different from a memoir because she's sort of more present in the experience, but it's about going through a divorce, being a writer, sort of restarting a life at age 50.
Wow.
And it's just the most beautiful book. I think she's such a precise and insightful writer, and I love her so much. And I would 100% recommend that book.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so you have to read that.
Secretly, why I do these is just to get book recommendations myself and not for any other reason.
If you ever talk to her, you have to invite me.
Okay, you can moderate.
Yeah.
What book are you reading right now?
I'm actually reading, let me see. I just got this book. It's by Morgan Parker, who is a poet, a novelist, an essayist. She writes everything, but it's essays about identity, being African American. I mean, just so many things.
Yeah.
She's an amazing writer who is always doing that thing that I was talking about earlier, the like funny, sad,
Mhm.
um, kind of hitting you with one when you're sort of in the other mode. I think she does
Yeah.
it so well. And so it's yeah, it's an amazing book.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was so wonderful. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your wisdom and all of it. And I'm so excited for people to have this book.
This meant so much. And you asked amazingly hard-hitting
I know, sorry.
philosophical questions,
Sometimes I'm like,
which
I feel bad because you're in the hot seat and I just get to ask these like questions, but
no,
these are the things that were going through my mind as I was reading it. So thank you for entertaining them.
I mean, and it's why I wrote the book, so I really brought it upon myself, and I love thinking about it. So it's more about asking the questions than about having any answers, I hope.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and I'm very excited for people to read it.
Kaya,
Hi.
bye.